Grammar. Just saying the word makes some break out in a cold sweat. The fusion of information from the form of a word and its syntactical relationship is what gives us meaning. In Latin, morphology is very important. The form of the word gives us an indication of how it's being used. After we understand the meaning as given by the form of a word, we now can examine the relationship a word or words have with other words. It is these relationships that create the concept of syntax, how words relate to one another. What kind of relationship gives rise to what kind of meaning? In this presentation, we will examine infinitives. In particular, the morphology or the formation of infinitives. So let's examine the word infinitive. The root of the word comes from the Latin word that means limit or boundary. The suffix means having the characteristic or quality of, and the prefix means not. When you put it all together, an infinitive is a verbal concept that is not limited by person. Although not conjugated, infinitives have tense, voice, and all the other syntactical structures with verbs. Infinitives appear in the present, perfect, and future tenses. But remember, tense is relative time. Infinitives also have active and passive voice. Let's take a look at the form of the infinitive with which we are most familiar. That is, the present active infinitive. We find that form in the second principal part of our vocabulary entry for verbs. To form the present passive infinitive in the first, second, and fourth conjugations, drop the final E of the second principal part and in its place put a long I. For the third conjugation, drop the entire ERE and put an I in its place. Remember, the third conjugation is very different. So that's the present active and present passive infinitives. The question becomes, how do I form a perfect active infinitive? It just makes sense. I'll use the perfect active stem and add esse. The perfect active stem is the third principal part without the personal ending. The perfect active stem brings meaning, active voice, and perfect tense. Then when we add esse, we bring the same relative time, it's the present. We bring no new meaning, because what does to be mean after all? And we bring the infinitive characteristic. Using amo, start with the perfect stem, AMAV, add esse, and then when the two get joined together, that first E of esse becomes an I. Amo wisse, to have loved. By adding esse to the perfect active stem, the third principal part, we get porta wisse, doku wisse, egisse, capisse, and audi wisse. So the next question is, how do we make a perfect passive infinitive? In fundamentally the same way. We'll start with the perfect passive participle, and then add as a separately stated word the infinitive of the verb to be. The perfect passive participle is what we know as the fourth principal part. It brings meaning, passive voice, and perfect tense. Then we'll add esse, the infinitive of the verb to be, which brings no new meaning, no new relative time, and the infinitive concept. That will then produce portatus esse, doctus esse, octus esse, captus esse, and auditus esse. Yes, you guessed it. How do we form a future active infinitive? The answer is, of course, just as we did with the perfect infinitives. We'll start with a future active participle and add the infinitive of the verb to be. The future active participle is the fourth principal part with a UR before the US, and that will bring meaning, future tense, and active voice. Then when we bring esse, the infinitive of the verb to be, we bring no new relative time, no new meaning, but we do bring the infinitive characteristic. This results in portaturus esse, docturus esse, octurus esse, capturus esse, and auditurus esse. The next question is, how are we going to form future passive infinitives? It's a complicated issue that we're going to save for another day. But in order to read Latin effectively, you will have to master infinitives. Practice until you can recognize the forms instantaneously. Master the infinitive forms. It is only after mastering those forms can one truly begin to recognize the relationships of those infinitives with other words in a clause, phrase, or a sentence. With mastery of the infinitive forms, and instantaneous recognition of the relationships or syntax of those infinitive forms, true reading of the Latin can occur. The process goes from a word-for-word evaluation to reading as a Roman would read.